Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow, the world's only podcast dedicated to the question of world citizenship and how we get there. All of us watch the news from time to time, and we can think back to news stories that we've seen this year, last year, back a decade, back 2 or 3 decades. And if you think back to 1999, you might remember a conflict in the Balkans, the latest conflict in the Balkans, which was the war in Kosovo, where the Serbian minority were wiping out the Albanian majority. And the situation got so bad that NATO felt compelled to intervene militarily, and the war lasted, I think it was 82 days from memory. And then within hours of the war ending, the UN entered the territory of Kosovo, which was part of the former Yugoslavia, of course, and began to do work there under the auspices of something called the United Nations Mission in Kosovo, UNMIK, and it became the government for a while. And after that, by the way, a year or two later, the United Nations set up a government in East Timor as well and brought them from occupation into independence. And that was the objective here in Kosovo. So who were the people that actually went into Kosovo and began to form a government and began to set up structures and do law reform and try to provide a sense of stability and justice? So there, of course, were soldiers, but there was also a whole cavalcade of international aid workers, including the two people that are doing the podcast today. So one of them was me, who went in a few days after NATO entered the territory. And the other is our guest today, who we're very happy to have, my old friend, José Arraiza, who's speaking to us from Madrid. Welcome to Democracy Tomorrow, José. How are you today?
Very good. Very happy to be talking to you and remembering those days in Kosovo.
Do you remember? I mean, I remember, I'll give you just a quick example first. I remember going in on the first day that we entered the territory in this very rickety bus. It was some local bus filled with like abandoned desks and tables and mattresses and really old stuff. I mean, nothing new. It was all old, kind of former Soviet Union stuff that we were transporting into the capital, Pristina. So I guess so they could be used by the new UNMIK government. But, as we were talking before we started recording, all around us, all we saw was, of course, damaged buildings by the thousands, impromptu graves everywhere, just mounds of dirt with a very simple headstone, who were the largely civilians and some soldiers who were killed in the process, and then just burning houses and smoke everywhere. And I had the realization, for months ahead of time, during watching that war and seeing the repression that was being carried out against the Albanian majority by the Serbian minority, certainly made me feel a sense that, justice has to come to this place. I'm not necessarily an advocate for military force at all. But this was right after Bosnia, just a 2 or 3 year period after Bosnia, where the whole world basically said to NATO and others, you really should have gone into Bosnia way before you did, because you could have saved the lives of thousands and thousands of people. So that was the kind of attitude at the time. And it was also still the early stages at the end of the Cold War. And, things that were not possible during the Cold War suddenly became possible. And one of them was the use of force. Granted, this was not with Security Council authorization. And that made it not just technically illegal, but highly controversial in the eyes of many people, in particular the groups that were supporting the Serbs. Nonetheless, I noticed on that very first ride in, first of all, I thought, oh, these are just smoldering ruins of houses that must have been bombed, last week when NATO was still bombing. And then it dawned on me, and it was crystal clear. This was reverse ethnic cleansing happening before our very eyes. And it was so depressing to see that, there was this sense of, oh, there will be justice found, led by the international community, to protect the rights of these people who are being so brutalized. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me, wait a minute, those are Serb houses that are burning. Those are not Albanian Kosovar houses that are burning. Those are Serb houses that are burning by the new victors who were suddenly able to take care of their own affairs. And, no matter who does ethnic cleansing, no matter who burns people's houses, it's wrong and it's illegal and it's not a good thing. And that kind of set the tone for what is still really, in many respects, an unresolved issue. What memories do you have from like when you first entered? How did you enter? By air, by land? How did you come in?
Well, I had a similar experience. First of all, when I was a university student, I was learning about what was happening in Bosnia, and I really became interested into this conflict. I wanted to be a war correspondent, So in July '99, I actually went into Macedonia to to report to the Spanish newspapers. I wanted to be a special correspondent, and I did. I wrote news, and then I entered Kosovo around late July, August, and I remember, those foggy roads from Pristina to Mitrovica, and watching this divided city with still all the destruction and all the chaos of the post-war. And funnily enough, that's when I started my peace building and humanitarian career, because the UN was looking for people to administer Kosovo. And suddenly I saw myself being the deputy administrator to a Serbian municipality. So I was new to Kosovo, and suddenly I find myself into this northern Kosovo village where it was very close to Mitrovica, and it had a single Albanian village just at the entrance of the municipality of Zubin Potok. And the whole Albanian village, its name is Chabra or Chaber, had been flattened. It had been, it was not war damage. It had actually been razed to the ground and bulldozed in an effort to make the Serbian municipality ethnically homogeneous. But as you said, there was a reverse violence or reverse ethnic cleansing going on. And I remember driving up the muddy hills in the fall, like now, between white oaks, um, going to the small Serbian villages that were bordering in the Albanian municipality or majority Albanian municipality now of Istok. And there had been attacks on a small, very, very small Serbian village, with very old houses that resembled, the houses from the 50s. And these elderly people had been shot at, So we were driving these muddy roads to interview these people. We were a bit afraid because there still were many landmines. We were trying to prevent again an escalation of the conflict. From then on, it was a whole story of years trying to stabilize this place, and there were again waves of violence in 2004. There was a massive violence against the Serbian community with thousands of displaced. But still, it was a different time. It was the time when the international community had a sense of responsibility, what was called then the responsibility to protect, to intervene and make sure that gross human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide were prevented, because of this whole history of the 90s, Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo. And for me, the paradox is that now suddenly we see ourselves in a world where we have seem to be going in the opposite direction. We've seen in the last years Brexit. We've seen Trump getting to the US government. We've seen the war in Ukraine escalating, the last conflict in Gaza, and basically a completely complete change of paradigm where world leaders are not only not intervening, but in some cases they are even saying crazy things like, like Trump in February when he said, actually what we will do is, empty Gaza and create a Riviera for developers to come and, basically turn it into a resort, which I must say is a position that has changed, and now we have a lot of hope in the stabilization of the situation in Gaza and so on. But just this to, from this foggy road in Mitrovica, August 99 until today, it's been now, I'm afraid, 25 years, which means we are 25 years older. But it's very very different panorama, and I think it deserves a reflection on what have we done or what have we not done or what we should do to make sure that the international community of states takes back this agenda to prevent atrocities, to intervene whenever it's necessary, and to basically promote peace. I'm sure you have been watching the news about Sudan in the last days. It's been atrocious. I've seen videos of mass executions and all kinds of atrocities that shouldn't be happening today, no? And so, what should we do about it? What kind of ideas should we promote or develop to make sure that we take that track, no, of
Mm.
having a responsibility to protect?
Well, ultimately, like viewed from a macro perspective, right? You either have a system where everybody groups together with their so-called own kind, right? Which is the direction many countries are going in, or you have this middle way, which is kind of the de facto world we have of nation states, where they're semi-cosmopolitan countries of people from different places. And then you have the vision that I have, and I think you have too, of a world in which all of us exist as equals within a larger political structure in which we all have the same rights and the same responsibilities. And I think to put a positive spin on a negative situation, and the current reality is a negative situation, I think, when you see how bad it can get when people go completely inward and when they identify only with their own so-called ethnic group or religious group or color group, whatever it may be, that doesn't yield the best results. And in fact, it almost always fails, particularly in the world as it is today, when it's been never more integrated, more interdependent at an ecological, at an environmental, at an economic, at a social, at a legal, and all these different cultural levels. The world is essentially one place, and it always has been, but now you can see it in ways that you could not see that before, and you can experience it. The ease of travel, the amount of times people are able to interact with people from other places, and the list goes on. I firmly believe there is a huge group of human beings in the world today that would immediately jump at the chance to live in a world based on the fundamental premises of essentially human rights law, and to extend it a little bit further, world citizenship, where all of us were engaged with everything going on in the world at a certain level. And so that's putting a positive spin on a negative situation. But in the meantime, we have crisis after crisis. We have not just an ever-growing number of wars that do not stop and then just keep continuing on. We also have a dramatic reduction in humanitarian expenditures and aid budgets led by the United States, but they're not alone. We have correspondingly a very large increase in military expenditures. And, I was just reading a report from the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research internationally, SIPRI, and, they're saying that military expenditures now are at the highest level that they've been at in 4 decades, and that a whole range of countries, I mean, we're now spending something in the range of $2.7 trillion globally every year on military uh, hardware and soldiers and armies and boats and everything else. I mean, that money, if it was put in a different direction, could eradicate certain diseases, could provide an adequate home to everyone living on Earth, could provide free medical care to everyone living on Earth, and the list goes on. And yet we just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And, anytime there's ever been arms races throughout history, it has always ended tragically. It has not ended in a state of perpetual peace. So, a lot of structural developments are moving, very much in the wrong direction. And I think, just more and more people have to essentially come out of the woodwork and say, this is not the world that I want to see. It's not the world I want my children or their children's children to inherit. And, you know, any sort of logical approach to how we should arrange ourselves politically has to be premised first and foremost on our shared humanity. And, both you and I have not just worked in Kosovo, we've worked in countless other countries. I mean, I've worked in over 80 countries. I don't know how many countries you've worked in, it was quite a few. And of course, we worked a lot together in another problem case, Myanmar, where we worked together for many years. And we even wrote a book about it, our work together there on housing, land, and property rights. And that was another depressing case where you had, the beginnings of a new democracy in 2011. And then 10 short years later, all of a sudden the military came back and pulled off a coup. And now we're back to square one, and there's massive civil war throughout the country. And it's gone backwards again.
Yeah.
Quick and easy answers are not readily available, but where do we go from here?
Yes. I mean, when you were talking about the citizenship issue, I was remembering, in at that time, 2001, I went to East Timor also, and I participated in a project to register, to give people a civil registration card in the hills of East Timor, So I
Yeah.
was going with this Tata. Tata is really strong, but, crashy kind of 4x4. And we were going to the indigenous villages and had all these indigenous people come to take their picture, because for them the civil registration card was a picture. They didn't have any picture, no. And we were basically making citizens, no. We were making them citizens with equal
Yeah.
rights after a brutal dictatorship and the invasion and the colonial period of East Timor towards a democracy, no? The same like in Kosovo. Then years later, when I arrived in Myanmar, before even meeting you, my project was actually the same. We were going to the villages in the southeast of Myanmar, which is beautiful. I think it's the most beautiful place I've ever been, and I'm still in love with Southeast Myanmar. And my heart is really crying watching what's happening there. No, and I was going to these villages with the officials of the Myanmar Ministry of Immigration, and we were setting up these offices in the current villages where people will get an ID card in one day. No, it was a one-stop service, same as in East Timor, same as in Kosovo, where I also did that, by the way, for the United Nations mission in Kosovo. But then we came against the 1982 citizenship law, which is a law that is applicable in Myanmar, and which basically says that only certain ethnic groups, which are considered national races or Tainjinta, have direct and easy access to citizenship. And anybody else whose ancestors, maybe grandfather, may have come from what is today India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, has a lot of difficulties, to access citizenship. And even when they access citizenship, it's a standard type of citizenship. It's called naturalized citizenship, even though it has nothing to do with what we call naturalized citizenship in Spain or other countries. I mean, to cut long story short, I will have like this woman coming to the one-stop service in the village where we were working, and the Ministry of Immigration officials will deny her the right to be a citizen, and I will be absolutely astonished, and I will look at her face and her expression when the immigration officials will tell her, no, no, you are not a Myanmar citizen, and I will be arguing with them like, I mean, this is insane. I mean, this is a lady who has lived in this village forever, whose parents have been born here. Why are you denying this person's citizenship? It's beyond cruel, no? And but actually, it followed this ideology or these ideas that more and more are becoming mainstream in even in Western societies. That there is a core of authentic citizens, no, and anybody else who may have a migrant background does not have a right to equal citizenship, implying equal access to rights, etc., etc. And when I was working in Myanmar at that time, that's 10 years ago, I was thinking, okay, this is insane. This law is obsolete. How can it be? It's really a relic from the past, no? And unfortunately, now, with all these far right movements and this, xenophobia becoming mainstream, I see these ideas becoming normal in my own country, and in European, in American societies, no, suddenly the migrant or the persons that are not considered to be racially, pure or whatever, are being targeted, no. So in the U.S. we have the infamous ICE, no, or ICE, targeting all kind of vulnerable people, and creating all these horror stories of elderly people being sent back to Pakistan after living in the US for 50 years, no, and things like that. And in Spain, we are recovering this idea of the old Spaniard, no, which is an idea that we had also in the Middle Ages, no. There was the Castellano Viejo, who was the pure Spaniards, who were the pure Spaniards in opposition to the new Spaniards, who will be, Jewish ascent or Muslim ascent, Gypsy, etc., etc. No, so I mean, just this whole story of trying to help Timorese, Kosovars, and then Burmese people to be full citizens has made me encounter this difficult issue of seeking full citizenship for everybody, what you call world citizenship in your book, but which also implies the fight against statelessness, which is really a scourge still for millions of people, no? And where we also have to, maintain our energy and our whatever stamina we may have left after all these disasters, no?
Absolutely true. But so most of the places where these new movements are forming, right? These authoritarian, extreme right wing, anti-immigrant, very racist movements are emerging and sometimes taking power. They're basically premised on an us versus them mentality, right? So there's us, the good guys, and there's them, the bad guys. And if we can just get rid of the bad guys, everything will be okay. It's the most simplistic, ridiculous, absurd sort of ideology, but nonetheless, it's very real. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety about formerly mono-ethnic societies becoming multi-ethnic and so on and so forth. But I would say that the natural evolutionary process of a particular species inhabiting a particular planet is that there's going to be an increasing amount of mixing and mingling of those different peoples who are only different because of the geographical location in which they were originally formed. So if the weather was super hot, the skin color tended to be more brown. If the weather was cold and very icy, the skin color tended to be white, etc., etc. Has no real inherent meaning whatsoever. But the question I have for you, Jose, is how did you how do you think you came to the position that all humans are equal, essentially? How did you get to the point of wanting to go work in very, very difficult circumstances in very difficult parts of the world, with a view to helping people that you'd never met before? Some of them you don't even ever have a chance of meeting at all. And what was it that drove you to do that and to continue to do that? What do you think? And what can people that don't think that way learn from Jose Arraiza's experience?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from my parents, because my mother, especially, she worked decades, to help migrants, Moroccan migrants, integrate here in my town
Mm-hmm.
in Spain. In the 1980s, the Moroccan migrants were living in slums,
Mm-hmm.
very near to my house, maybe less than 1 kilometer from my home when I was a kid. And my mother was doing all this work to make sure that they will get, the children will be able to go to school, the adults will get an address, and they will have access to healthcare and so on. And then also my parents were very, very much travelers. They went to India, and at a time when Spaniards were not traveling abroad as much as now. And I was like very curious about all these objects and these stories that they were bringing. So actually, my first go at something humanitarian, it's funny, but I went to Calcutta. I went to Calcutta and did some volunteer work for Mother Teresa, and this was when Mother Teresa was alive. It was 1994 or 93, something like that. So I did that, and I did a lot of pretty crazy experiences. I went to Cuba, worked I was a volunteer there with the young communists of Cuba, which were everything but communist, by the way, and also in other places. But really, what made me into a humanitarian was that time when, and we go back to this foggy road in the morning, driving from Pristina to Mitrovica in August 99. United Nations volunteer trying to fix a very difficult situation. So from then on, it has been all one conflict after the other. But I think the people that is suffering, and that is suffering enormously. I think that really creates an obligation for us in developed countries to do as much as we can to improve the situation. I mean, I mentioned Sudan before. I think Sudan is really the worst, the toughest situation I've seen for vulnerable people. In my experience, and it really creates a sense of urgency to make sure that all efforts towards peace building, humanitarian assistance, and development are not impaired, by this surge of self-centered, nationalistic, xenophobic ideologies. And I will say, I wouldn't deny that migration creates problems. There are problems, and it's true that there needs to be efforts towards integration by everybody, and in some cases, this requires special measures and legislation and so on. But at the end, the main principle has to be equal rights, the right to migrate, the benefits of what you started, right? You say the peace dividend, and the benefits of migration and multicultural societies.
I mean, almost every society in the world that has become a multi-ethnic society has flourished immensely compared to the time before they became a cosmopolitan multi-ethnic society. And Australia is a classic case in point, but there's countless others that got richer, got more interesting, got more fun to be in, more stable, and the list goes on. And yet, though, politicians, and particularly those on the right side of the equation, know that they can use the fear of the other, the immigrant, the dirty criminal, the drug dealer, to really enrage people and get them to vote for them. And so we're still not at a stage where people are able to systematically see through that stuff. And that's the real worrying thing. I mean, you could have a very right-wing government in England, for instance, at the next upcoming election, that could displace a very huge Labor majority government just because of one charismatic leader and some followers who believe that somehow that country will be better without immigrants. And I think we all need to stand back and just think of those immigrants much more as fellow humans than as the other. Because the second you engage with people from other places, you get to know them, you very quickly see that they're exactly like you and your family. They want exactly the same things. They have the same needs, the same wishes. Yeah, some of them may misbehave and some of them may break the rules, but by and large, most people, most places are really great humans. And, we need to put a much stronger emphasis on that again and try to restore the promise of, the United Nations Charter and everything that came after 1945, and begin starting to think about what the next stage forward is, instead of looking backward, instead of trying to recreate the so-called perfection of the past. We need to start thinking much more systematically about how to build a better world in which there is no poverty, in which there are no wars anymore, in which there is much less inequality than today, in a world where climate change is actually properly managed, where, mass deforestation no longer occurs, where the acidification of the oceans stops, and the list goes on and on and on. And ultimately, of course, where there are no nuclear weapons. We have it within our grasp as humans to build that world. And, it's certainly our hope here that we can inspire ever-growing numbers of people to, in whatever way you can, to live a world citizen life in that way. And that's certainly what both you and I have tried to do in our adult life in our own ways, trying to live out our principles by working in the human rights field, working in post-conflict situations, working in identity documentation, citizenship initiatives, countries emerging from conflict, emerging from occupation. And I mean, that's maybe a good place to end, because there's so much negativity in the world today. Remember that East Timor was occupied for 25 years by a previous Indonesian government and killed 1/3 of the population, either through starvation or outright murder. And suddenly, out of the blue, they got independence. It was a miracle. I was deeply engaged with the liberation struggle, and a lot of my old friends are now running that country. It was an incredible moment when they went from being completely occupied to suddenly winning the struggle. Same with the apartheid movement, anti-apartheid movement, which I also worked with a lot in the 1980s and 90s. It never seemed really that it was going to change. It was so entrenched. It was so deep, like it was going to last forever, but we were still going to fight the good fight. And lo and behold, it ended. And there's lots of cases like this in the world where what seems impossible, what seems to be oppressive and brutal and horrible and will remain that way forever, suddenly something better happens. Wars do end and societies do change, and they don't always change for the better, but often they do. And I think we have to, remember that and try to create the conditions that can lead to it. It seemed like that was happening in Myanmar when we both started working there in 2011. It was really going to be the new dawn. It was going to be this new era. There was going to be true peace and harmony amongst peoples. And then all of a sudden, it all went wrong. But for a while, it was pretty good. And, we can apply that to, places across the world. So let's try to push things as far as we can in our own ways. And, we continue to believe that conferring official world citizenship status on every human born from now until eternity is the way to do that. And for those who already are born, everyone alive today, all 8.2 billion of us, there are very clear and easy legal steps we can take to enhance our citizenship statuses by adding one more layer of citizenship, and that is world citizenship. We can do that, and I hope that I mentioned it in our last episode of Democracy Tomorrow. We have this initiative to try to get every single local government in the world to adopt the same resolution, giving them the local authority jurisdiction to begin steps to confer legal world citizenship status on everyone under their jurisdiction. And we have to start doing things like that to make it real. These are not just esoteric, pie in the sky, dreamy little ideas. They're real ones. And we're not as far from it as people may think. The European Union was once a pipe dream, could never happen, right? Thousands of years of fighting against each other, and suddenly, all of a sudden, 27 countries came together and merged like never before. And there are countless other examples. And when you look at the global system, the simple fact that, why do airports everywhere look essentially the same? Why do houses have four walls and a roof and windows and doors, no matter what country it's in? Why does everybody need to eat a meal in order to get rid of hunger? The list goes on. The similarities are huge. They're already there to look at. You don't have to give up the things that you hold dear in order to embrace the rest of humanity. And I think that's a really important point. And all of us have a role to play in trying to reduce human suffering. And by seeing the human race as our family, it makes it a lot easier to do work that is aimed at that objective. Any final words, Jose?
Well, you know, the the anthropologist Margaret Mead,
Mm-hmm.
she placed the beginning of civilization in the first ever seen evidence of a leg that had been broken, being fixed. No, somebody helped 31,000 years ago. Somebody helped uh, another fellow human being to fix a broken leg. No, so I think this
Mm.
this will to help, this possibility of helping is what makes us human, and we have to keep that effort. You mentioned Myanmar's hopes in 2011. Sudan also had, very few years ago, had a really nice constitution which promised equal rights for women also, and a lot of hopes that now have been shattered. But the battle may have been lost, but the war is not over. And we will keep pushing for democracy and human rights in Sudan, Myanmar, and wherever it is. I think the movement for human rights, for world citizenship, it's a no surrender movement. So we will keep the energy as long as it is necessary. So it has been very nice to talk with you about these issues, and also try to recover a bit the motivation after what we are seeing every day on TV and the media. So thank you
Absolutely.
very much, Scott,
Well,
for
thank
this.
you, Jose. It's always nice to talk to you. And, I remember so fondly all those nights in Myanmar running all around trying to get good things to happen, and little victories here and there. Like that was a really great time. And it was just so tragic to see it all kind of fall apart again in 2021. And it's nowhere near resolution now. But, the thing is, as you said, it's like fighting the impossible dream, but you don't stop fighting for it. And we fight peacefully, we fight with words, and we try to be convincing, but we try to, all of us have a role to play. All 8.2 billion of us are active players in creating the global society that we get. And all of us have that little kernel of world citizenship within us somewhere. Even the most nationalistic, the most hateful, racist, horrible person, somewhere, if you look hard enough, they've got that little nodule of world citizenship in there just waiting to come out. And, it's our hope that more and more people draw on that and start seeing that, collaboration actually works and cooperation actually works. And that at our core, we're really basically egalitarian beings. We don't want societies where there's a super small, ultra wealthy elite and everyone else kind of falling way below that level. Most people, most places, by a huge majority, want things to be more or less egalitarian and want things to be peaceful. And that's I think, the essential essence of what it means to be human. So thank you again, Jose. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This is Democracy Tomorrow. Please like and subscribe. Suggest topics for future episodes and future guests, and we'll try to arrange that. And with that, we'll say goodnight. All the best. Take care, everyone. Bye.